So welcome. Here we are, APRA AMCOS Insights for Producers. I would just like to say thank you for joining us online this evening from wherever you are. And I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm joining you. That is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. It was a glorious day, full of sunshine on Gadigal land, although it's clouding over now. But I got out there, went for a walk by the sea, and just was grateful to be there then and taking a moment now to be thankful again. And of course, I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands that you're joining us from, no matter where you are. You could be joining us from anywhere around the world. That's the beauty of these webinars. So yes, acknowledgement and thanks for that. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. You'll notice that there is no chat function. Instead, tonight you have a Q&A facility. So on your Zoom screen at the top or at the bottom, depending on your setup, you'll see that there's Q&A. You can click on that and you can ask questions throughout tonight's webinar. So just type in any questions that you get. We are going to answer questions live at the end with our guest speaker, but any that might pertain to APRA, we will answer along the way, which I should stop using the royal we and introduce who I'm here with. So tonight, joining me on the call, I have Caroline McKnight, Manager of National Education and Outreach, and of course, our guest speaker, Kurt Luthy. Little summary of what we're going to talk about this evening. Of course, all things producer. So everything from royalties for producers. What are they? How, like producer points, what are they? How do they work? When are you entitled to royalties? When are you not? And how does that maybe affect whether or not you're eligible to be an APRA member or not? We're going to go through the basics of contracts. We're going to talk about fees in place of royalties and all sorts of things. We're going to talk about just general producer basics and know-how. Trust me, Kurt is going to be much more eloquent when it comes to this than I am. We are recording tonight's session and we will make that recording available to you in the days following tonight's webinar. Just takes our comms team a little bit of time to edit and get it all ready. So I've now mentioned his name twice. Tonight, we're joined by the wonderful Kurt Luthy. Kurt comes from a musical background as a DJ and is still passionately involved in the music industry. Kurt was the executive producer of ARIA-nominated compilation albums To Hell and Bacharach, featuring iconic artists the Whitlams, Regurgitator, Rebecca's Empire, just to name a few, and Corroboration, an album of artist collaborations with tracks combining artists such as The Cruel Sea and Native Rhyme, Kylie Minogue and Jimmy Little. This evening, Kurt is here as the Executive Director of the Music Producers Guild of Australia, or MPEG. The Guild was launched in 2022 to provide a voice for its members, representing their commercial interests and the community through advocacy and engagement. In this role, Kurt promotes education about the industry through appearances like this and events and even podcasts like the MPW podcasts, which you can check out on Spotify and Apple. He has been heavily involved in organising the annual MPEG Awards, which recognise the success and talent of Australian music producers, and in launching the Fast Track Fellowship for skills development, which will be granted to a Victorian producer. That's open now. You'll hear more about that. Like Batman, Kurt leads a dual life in the music industry as an artist manager at Catherine Harity Management, to acts who have scooped up ARIA Awards, Australian Women in Music Awards, International Songwriting Awards, and Sydney Theatre Awards. And as if that wasn't enough, Kurt is currently undertaking a Bachelor of Laws, which is due to complete later this year. So Kurt, thank you for taking time out from all of that to join us. I would like to throw over to you. Please enlighten us about APRA AMCOS and producers.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks, Caroline. And that was a really comprehensive bio that you just gave me. So you've spared me a fair bit of work. So thank you for that. Look, the one thing I will add is I come to all of this as a music lover. It is my first passion. It's been that way ever since I was a child. I grew up in a household filled with music, and that maintains itself to this very day. So, you know, I'm going to assume that we are all here because we love music, and we can take it from there. So look, Nikki's succinctly put in my credentials, for lack of a better term, and I'd like to jump in really by starting to talk about MPEG, which of course is the Music Producers and Engineers Guild of Australia. So what we do is we are the peak body for music producers and engineers. Currently, we have approximately 500 members, 504 to be exact. And interestingly, I crunched these numbers when we were prepping for this webinar, and 85% of our members are APRA AMCOS members. So clearly that indicates that there are a lot of producers out there who are bona fide or identify as songwriters, which is really great to see that sort of crossover and to be teaming up with APRA AMCOS to discuss this. One of the main things that MPEG does is advocacy. We are there for our members. We are there for the cohort of producers and sound engineers and audio engineers and mix engineers nationwide. For a very long time, there was no sort of concentrated body that was looking out for that cohort. So in her infinite wisdom, the wonderful chair of MPEG, Anna Laverty, throughout COVID, created MPEG and still is a fierce contributor and advocate on behalf of MPEG and on behalf of the producer community in this country. Some of the other things that we do include education. If you're an MPEG member, and by the way, I'm just going to advocate strongly that you are, then, you know, let me just check something. Oh, hang on, I'm jumping ahead. So I'm going to advocate strongly that you are or become an MPEG member. Because apart from doing things like our control room sessions, which are monthly get-togethers where we will address, say, a technical aspect of music production, or we'll talk about a health and well-being aspect of operating in the music industry, because we all know that that is a fundamental element of our lives that needs to be addressed. And we'll also have regular social gatherings. So this really is an organisation focused on its members. Some of the other things that we do, and Nikki mentioned this, we have initiatives, and our very exciting one at the moment is in partnership with the VMDO, which is the Victorian Music Development Office, and they have very graciously afforded us the funds within which to send a Victorian-based producer over to the UK to work or create more networks, to get introductions, to attend industry events in the UK. That's going to take place over July and August of this year. And if you are based in Victoria, then I firmly recommend that you hit up our website or go to the VMDO website and have a look and see if you are eligible for this truly incredible fellowship that we are offering. Look, obviously this is a Victorian-based one, and we are keen to see this sort of program rolled out nationwide. So, you know, talk to your local rep in your particular state or territory, and see if we can get something going there as well. Okay, so as Nikki also mentioned, there's a whole bunch of topics that we're going to cover tonight, so I'll try and be as succinct as possible. I also recognize that many of you may already be across this, so if you are, that's great. But I'm mindful that, you know, I wanted to take it in on an introductory level so that people who aren't across it really can get a bit more of an idea of what we're talking about here. So the first cab off the rank is going to be the difference between a studio producer versus a writing producer, and why this matters for APRA AMCOS membership. After that, I'll head into what are producer points and how do they work. Then we're going to drill down a little bit more on producer royalties, master royalties versus compositional or publishing royalties, which applies and when. And then we'll look at charging fixed price fees as an alternative to royalty shares. Now, the meaty topic of when to use a contract and what are some of the basic terms a producer agreement should include will follow that. We're going to round out with some tips for using pre-made beats and licensing your beats via third-party websites. So there's a fair bit to get through. I'll take it as steadily as possible so that I don't rush. And as you know, there will be a Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to pose any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'm more than happy to take it on notice and I'll give you my email and we can follow up then. Okay, let's jump in. The difference between a studio producer versus a songwriting producer. Oh, excuse my trigger happy there, and why this matters for APRA AMCOS members. So look, I'll start out with the studio producer. And once again, you're going to be across some of this, but these are just the headline points of what I think, really a studio producer brings to the party. So a studio producer will have the technical skills and the proficiency to produce, record, and mix the recorded masters. And by the recorded masters, I mean the songs. Okay, they're going to bring in a creative as well as sonic ideas to the session. They bring this to the table, so this can include instrumentation and arrangements. Okay, the reason you're getting a producer into the room with you is because they are a creative. If you just wanted an engineer to record your music, then that's what you'd get. But that's not what a producer is. So the producer really is another creative force in the studio with you. And one of the things that they really should do and focus on doing is harness the artist's essence and vision. They really need to work alongside the artist to really drill down on what is it you're trying to achieve, what is the sound that you want, all of those elements. And then they're going to explore ways to execute and capitalize on that vision. Furthermore, the studio producer is going to guide the artist, okay? They're going to try and elicit the best take, the best approach, and really try and make them comfortable, There's a deeply psychological element that goes into being a good studio producer. And by that, I mean providing psychological support and being a good listening board and understanding people. So it's not just about music. It is about really understanding people, and in fulfilling that role as well, they're going to provide some moral support. They're also potentially, and not always, but potentially, they're going to navigate competing interests. And by that, I mean, you might be in a situation where it's a band and you have several members, and there is a difference of opinion as to how something should be executed or the direction that you want to go in. Okay, so a good studio producer can really help smooth those waters. Other competing interests might come from your management. They might come from a record company, for example, who are really focused on pursuing a particular path for that artist and that recording. So, a good studio producer is going to be able to talk to all of those parties and hopefully find the happy median and get everybody through it and still deliver the best possible result from those sessions. The other thing about a studio producer is obviously they will typically, not always, but typically receive a royalty from those recorded masters. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the other topic. Now, when we talk about the songwriting producer, this element of production and this producer fulfills all those aforementioned roles of a studio producer. Okay, they come in with the technical know-how, they come in with the musical know-how, but they also contribute to the songwriting. Okay, now I appreciate that this can be a really gray area. Excuse me. And one of the questions that we get asked the most is, when does production become songwriting? Now, there are various sort of benchmarks, I believe, that need to be hit in order for that production to cross over to songwriting. Now, I'm I'm going to hasten to add that this is my personal opinion, but I also think it's one that actually is a valid one in terms of determining whether or not production has progressed into songwriting. And the real tenet of that, the real fundamental is, has the producer made a significantly material difference to the song? Okay, so they haven't just put in arrangements, they haven't just suggested some form of instrumentations. They've actually gone through and they have looked at that chorus, or they've looked at that middle eight, or they've looked at something and they have suggested to you, let's try this. Let's mix this up. I think we would be better placed if that chord progression went from this to that. I think you will get your message across lyrically far better if we change those words, you know. So these are things that really are fundamentally having a material difference on the song that you brought into the studio to what is actually then going to be recorded. Now, this really does require a lot of honest and open discussion between the parties. Um, and another one of the things that people will often say to us is, that's a really awkward conversation to have. Now, I'm a fan of the awkward conversation. I really am, because I think they're imperative, especially so that everyone knows where they stand and you're all on the same page. Okay. Now, there are so many different ways that you might approach how you're going to divvy up the shares in songwriting. Now, most of you will know about Nashville rules, whereby whoever's in the room gets an equal split. You might sort of separate it out between top line and composition. My general rule of thumb is be honest and equitable about who actually contributed what. And once again, this is preferential. You know, like I say, you might totally be into Nashville rules, okay? And that's completely fine. But, you know, I'll often at the end of sessions get a rather, you know, detailed list of the percentages broken down of who is getting what split of the song. And that can range from 5% to 50%. And that is usually detailed as to the particular contribution that was forthcoming from the producer. So, you know, it really does depend on how you like to approach it. And it really is, for me, based in, was there a material difference added to the songwriting? You're in the room, you know what's gone on. As a manager, myself and my colleagues are typically reticent to just handle that, you know, as a managerial thing, you know, as an administrative thing, because we weren't there. So we can't honestly say, yeah, but A contributed this, B contributed that. So do as awkward as they can be, do get accustomed to having those questions if you think that, you know, or the producer suggests that it has now sort of migrated into songwriting territory. I hope that makes sense. And of course, hit me up afterwards and we can discuss it further. Now, in terms of that, and when it comes to, I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit here, because I just wanted to say that in terms of producer agreements and contracts, you can actually work something into your agreement that has a recognition of songwriting that can be predetermined. This usually doesn't apply if something happens on the fly in the session. But you may have already had a conversation prior to going into the studio with that producer and have said, so it says to the effect, it is acknowledged that the producer has contributed to the writing of the musical compositions underlying the masters. Or it could also say it is acknowledged that the producer will contribute to the writing of the musical compositions underlying the masters. Now, that is just a recognition, really, that you have had that conversation or you are open to it, and the intention is that songwriting will be a factor in what the producer is actually doing. Okay, so once again, I have jumped ahead a little bit there because that is more a contractual thing, but it gives you an indication of how this can be approached prior to even getting into a session. Now, why it matters to APRA AMCOS members. Now, there are some really obvious things here, and I am stating the obvious, so I don't mean for it to be so rudimentary. And again, I appreciate that you may have numerous other reasons as to why this matters to APRA AMCOS members. And I would happily invite Nikki and Caroline to weigh in on this as well. But one of the most obvious things for me is we all know that songwriting and a stake in songs really is one of the best assets you can have in the music industry, you know? So obviously, if you have a stake in songwriting, you're automatically increasing your capacity to earn, okay? So you're going to have increased income and revenue streams. You're also going to obviously increase your catalog of intellectual property. Now, this can really feed well into publishing deals, and I approach that from 2 points. You might have a publishing deal and you might have an advance that your publisher gave you. Okay, so obviously to pay down your advance, you're going to have, you know, a relatively steady contribution to your catalog, or you're going to have, you know, some pretty major hits. You know, you might have written an incredible hit, and that is paying off your publishing deal in one foul swoop. Good luck to you if that's the case. Tremendous work. But, you know, it really will help pay down your publishing deal. Otherwise, it can help you get a publishing deal. So, you know, if you're shopping around, and you know, we have worked with several producers who have publishing deals. You know, it's far from uncommon. So if you're in the market or you're really keen to secure a publishing deal, having those songwriting credits is going to be a huge asset. That's going to be an attractive option for a publisher, and that's where the publishing deal can come into play. My final point here is you know, is possibly banal. I don't mean it to be, but obviously the more songwriting you're doing, the more you are truly honing your craft. And any good producer is going to consistently work on honing that craft, because that then translates into not only technical and creative prowess, but it also puts a message out there for a whole bunch of other people who might be reading liner notes and go, oh, wow, that producer produced that, and they also contributed to the songwriting. So reputationally, it's going to be really, really good for you. And they're just a handful of the reasons why I think being a songwriting producer really matters to APRA AMCOS members. Now, what are producer royalties and how do they work? No matter what people think, this is not a dark art, you know. It may be, you know, and not commonly talked about, but it's not a dark art. And let's jump in. So producer points are a royalty, you know. They're usually in addition to the producer fee. Okay, so you get your upfront fee as a producer, and then you negotiate a percentage, an agreed percentage, which is commensurate with the producer's scope of work. And by that, I mean, what are you actually doing as the producer? Are you just, and I'll take just out of it, are you producing and recording? Or are you producing, recording, and mixing? Because dependent on the scope of work that you're doing, it's going to inform the sort of royalty that you can reasonably and realistically expect to discuss and negotiate. Now, producer points are typically deducted from the artist share of royalties, and I've given you a very basic pie graph here. So, you know, this is all coming out of the same royalty. Okay, so the artist and the producer. If we're talking about the artist, and just for, numbers' sake, the artist gets 20% of the royalty after recoupment, and the producer has negotiated a royalty of, say, maybe 3% for the production and 1% for mixing, hence 4% in total, that artist is now going to be looking at receiving a royalty of 16%, whereas the producer will take the 4%. Now, in some circles, maybe if you're Rick Rubin, maybe if you're, one of those truly stratospheric producers, you may be able to organize or negotiate that you get a royalty that sort of isn't necessarily attached to the artist, but typically that's how it's going to pan out. Now, there are two common ways of calculating royalties. The first is referred to as PPD, which is publish priced to dealer, and that's the wholesale price. Now, this is really certainly was the norm and the most common practice when we had the basic delivery of music being in the physical format. So, Warner Brothers or Warner Music Australia might sell into JB Hi-Fi a whole bunch of CDs or records, and that will have that wholesale price. And that is where the producer royalty will be calculated, from that wholesale price, not from the retail, because obviously the retail is that merchant adding on their markup. The other common way of calculating royalties is what we call net income or net receipts. Now, once again, this is a percentage, and this can work really well for indie acts who aren't attached to a label, and they can, because there's a chance that they might, notwithstanding any distribution fees or things like that, they might be taking the lion's share of any income that comes through the exploitation of the master recordings. Okay, so in that case, we would structure a deal whereby we look at what they're getting and we apply a percentage of those net receipts. And by net receipts, it actually does mean actual money coming into the artist, after those various deductions. So they're the two common ways of calculating royalties. Now, royalties are payable upon an agreed recoupment structure. And by recoupment, we mean once the money's made back. I will always try as a manager to attach that recoupment process to direct recording costs. And by that, I mean producer fees, studio fees, session player fees, mastering fees. And if the producer has been required to go and work interstate or something, you would also attach travel and accommodation. Okay, these are direct recording costs that had to be paid out in order to make the record. Equally, you might find you're working with an artist who wants to go to a beautiful seaside shack and record there. So, obviously everybody needs to get there. You might need to hire gear. You might also obviously have to hire a beachside shack. So they're the direct recording costs, and they will be dependent on the nature of the project. I've taken the liberty of just doing up a quick budget, which you would also put into your producer agreement. And I've mapped out all the various things that might occur in a recoupable situation. So, here I've got rehearsal studios for pre-production, that's a direct recording cost. We've gone into top shelf studios at $750 a day for 10 days. So there's our recouping. Now, my client, my producer, her name is Stella Hitz. She's tremendous. And she has her own mixed studio. So that's another direct recording cost. She had to travel. So we've got accommodation, we've got airfares, we've got ground transfers, and we've got per diems. And then we're going to add on Stella's fee. And in this instance, we're doing a per track rate. Okay, so that's going to include her time spent on pre-production, production, recording, and mixing. Okay, so we're just going to do that at $2,500 per song. And then we're going to add in mastering. Okay, so there you see we've got $42,300 plus GST elements as our budget. Now, that's all recoupable. Okay, so before anybody starts seeing a royalty, that money needs to be made back. And I often talk to Indiacs who can get a little overwhelmed by all of this. And my typical comment is, look, only when you're making money will a producer make money. So, it's don't be scared that they're coming in, they've been paid a fee, and they're going to take all this money. It's only ever when you've recouped those costs that a producer is entitled to a royalty, or at least that's how it is typically structured. Okay, so once recouped, the producer royalty is activated. And there are two methods on which you can do this. And this is kind of meaty, so we can talk about it later. But royalties will be calculated retroactively. And by that, we mean that once everything's recouped, we then go back to record one and start paying through. Alternatively, it can be structured that a royalty will be calculated prospectively, hence going forth. So, from the point of recoupment, everything's broken even. That's when the royalty starts getting paid out. Like I say, that can be a bigger conversation, so I'm happy to go there in another time. All right, so producer royalties. Again, master royalties versus composition, aka publishing, which applies and when. So master royalties, obviously, they're about the songs. So producer royalties are typically activated once the agreed recoupment threshold has been reached. We just spoke about that. Recoupment typically includes all direct recording costs. And look, an exception to the usual recoupment process can occur when your artist, your client has received a grant. They might have received $50,000 from a funding body. So it would be unfair for them to then expect that the producer should go through and recoup all of those costs if those costs were already covered by a funding body. And typically it wasn't a so-called commercial entity that then had to recoup the costs. You might find in these grant situations that some people have contributed their own money. That's not uncommon. So you would factor that into the deal, but you would only be factoring it in so much as how much was contributed. Now, sometimes there will be deductions and you will take a lesser royalty from your agreed royalty, and that will often happen with video clips. So it's not uncommon to see a contract say that the producer will receive 50% of their usual entitled royalty in the instance of video clips. So, deductions can come in and play. Composition royalties, however, as we know, copyright is enlivened upon the creation of the work, okay? So make sure that the splits are agreed and the works are registered. Once again, we're going to have an awkward conversation, potentially, if we haven't worked it out up front. But also there's the beauty of compositional royalties is there's the capacity to earn as soon as the song is out there, it's performed, and it's broadcast. As long as those songs are registered, you can start ticking over and start having income amassed. The beauty as well is compositional royalties aren't just tied to a master sound recording. Multiple revenue streams apply, and that's in live and public performance, broadcast, obviously, mechanical, as we just said. You might get a sync, which is fantastic. And we could talk more about syncs, so hit me up about that later. Or somebody might do a cover version, and there, once again, it's going to start ticking over and that money is going to flow to you. Now, recoupment can still be a factor if you've got a publishing advance. As I mentioned before, if you've got a publishing advance, you might have let's say $50,000 that you're advanced. Obviously, those songs that are starting to generate revenue, they're going to go towards, typically, they're going to go towards paying down your advance. So there are some of the key differences between the two sort of royalties. Now, charging a fixed price as an alternative to royalty shares. This is an interesting one because as a producer manager, I would nearly always, always, always seek to have a royalty. And that's kind of a speculative thing because you never know when a song may take off, And if you've put your heart and soul into that as a producer and have carved yourself out of the royalty share, that can be a bitter pill to swallow. That said, there is no right or wrong way to approach this. I know several producers and their managers who have as their preference take on the front end. And by that, I mean they do a straight up work for hire. Okay. So the artist pays them whatever the negotiated fee is, and the producer delivers. And here endeth the lesson. You walk away. Now, one of the advantages of that, obviously, is that there is minimal administration, um, minimal accounting, and you're not going to find yourself in the situation whereby you might have to enact an audit. Audits obviously are if you feel that the bookkeeping that's been presented to you isn't truly representative of where you think the true state of play is, and that you're owed more money, so you may choose to audit. Now, look, charging a fixed price can often come at the request of the commissioning party, and I've worked on several projects whereby the artist has gone, we will pay you more to forego a royalty. Now, once again, you do that in consultation. If if as a manager, I would consult with our client immediately and go, "This is what is offered." You want to think about that. And there are times whereby it really is a more attractive option, and you might just choose to do that. Like I say, this is preferential. There's no necessarily a right or a wrong way. But what I would do is make sure I got an increased upfront fee to compensate for the potential loss of royalties. Because let's face it, you do not want to see that song become an absolute international juggernaut and they paid you $500 more. So you're going to rely on your gut there as well. You really are going to rely on your knowledge of trends, of the scene, of how good you think the work is. And like I say, though, if the other party is really reticent to part with that, then negotiate yourself a better fee. If you have contributed to songwriting, I would always maintain the songwriting share. I would never give that up. So that's just my personal piece of advice. Don't let go of that, because once again, if this becomes a juggernaut, that revenue, that income is going to tick over and tick over nicely. Okay, when to use a contract? Here we go. There's quite a lot to go through, and I realize I'm starting to take up a fair bit of time, so I'll be as succinct as possible once again. When to use a contract? Okay, I'm going to start out by sort of differentiating between an agreement and a contract. An agreement is exactly that. By that, I mean we've agreed to do something. Now, for example, Nikki and I, we're making a record and everything's hunky-dory, and we have this tremendous working relationship, and it's all gone along and been working beautifully. But then something might hit a hiccup, okay? And we're then placed in a situation whereby we are reliant on our memory, we are reliant on our perception of what it was we agreed to. And I take this analogy from a very learned solicitor by the name of Brett Oaten, who I watched at the Seed last week. And I'm paraphrasing him, so attribution, but it made perfect sense, because if an agreement comes undone, if there is a dispute, perceptions will be different, memories will be different, and then you find yourself in a tussle. I have a personal credo, a personal mantra that I operate on, and that is mitigate, don't litigate. If you can cut this off at the pass, make sure you do it. So what a contract does in say in contrast to an agreement, a contract is really about reducing something to writing. Get it in writing, put it in a document. Then you have a tangible document that both parties have negotiated and both parties have agreed to, and it is concise and it clearly, explicitly stipulates the parameters and the terms and conditions upon which you entered into this. So my basic rule of thumb is always go to contract. They're not that scary. Like I say, if you're an MPEG member, fully paid MPEG member, we have one as a resource that you can use as a template. So like I say, it's reduced to writing, it's signed, it's executed by the parties, and there we have it. Usually it's going to go in the bottom drawer and it's not going to come out. But if things turn south, you are going into that bottom drawer and you're going to pull it out and you're going to say, subject to clause 8.4, this is what we had agreed. So I am a firm fan of using a contract pretty much at every step. If you're in this game, you're in it because you're doing it as a profession, typically, or at least you would love to do it as a profession. So, treat yourself as a professional. The other thing that I cannot advocate strongly enough is seek legal advice. There are still instances whereby myself or Kath Harrity or other managers that I work with, we may have seen numerous of these contracts, but if something pops up that we're not across, don't fluff it through, especially if you're a manager, because you're dealing with somebody else's, career here. So don't fluff it through. Seek legal advice. Not doing so can be really false economy. Pay the lawyer's fees. And like I say, full paying MPEG members, another shameless plug, have access to a producer contract template. All right, what are some of the basic terms of producer agreement should include? Firstly, the engagement. What is the scope of work? What are you actually doing? Get that in writing so there's no confusion. Are you producing, recording, and mixing? Great, have it down there. And if you are mixing, what are the parameters for revisions? How many revisions are you going to enact before you uh, you know, are going to start charging another fee? I mean, that's just sensible to get those things into the producer agreement, the engagement. What are the key deliverables? Here's another thing. What are you delivering once you've done the work? Are you delivering files, stems, session player releases, sample clearances? All of those need to be in there. So these are things that be across it. Don't get caught out at the end going, where are the session player releases? Did you clear that sample? Also, you might want to specify a delivery date so that everybody can continue working to their timelines. Budget, be as specific as possible. As I said, I gave that budget, map it all out and also consider including an amount for contingency. Fee, here we go. Let's talk money. State the total fee in there and state the payment structure. How are you going to be paid? We will typically operate on a payment structure of 50% prior to commencement and 50% prior to delivery of the files, okay? Now that's just to make sure that you do get paid prior to handing over all that hard work. The mixes will be signed off, you may have provided MP3s, etc. But if you can, get paid prior to the delivery of the files. Also flag potential extras, extra fees. For example, we often have a clause that says, for the avoidance of doubt, the delivery of any additional formats or versions of the masters will be subject to the availability of the producer and may incur extra fees. Okay, the royalty, once again, we're back to royalties. How will the royalty be calculated? Is it PBT? Is it net income? And when will those royalties start to flow? So map out the recoupment process. Here's a really big one, credit. Make sure you get a credit. For God's sake, get a credit, because this is your calling card. And if you're working for the limited, or if you're emerging and there's not much money up front, or whatever the case may be, it is your credits that are going to get you noticed further down the track, and you want those credits. So you also want to include in your contract how and where the producer will be credited. Is it going to be packaging on physical formats, metadata, digital artwork? It should be all of those. And you also want a little clause in there that's going to highlight how or what course of action will be taken to remedy a missing credit. Okay. Writing splits, you can have an annexure of a co-writing agreement, which are clearly defined splits, and talking about the works to be registered with APRA AMCOS and the relevant publishers. And you will also want to retain the right to administer your rights in that composition. Okay, I'm barreling through because I'm really taking up time. Finally, tips for using pre-made beats. If you are using pre-made beats, for God's sake, ensure that the beats are used legitimately and accredited. Don't go pillaging somebody else's stuff and throw it in there. Just don't do it. It's not worth the grief. If you're using cleared royalty-free samples, for example, from Splice, you can generate a certified license so that if anybody comes at you going, oh, that was a sample from here, you actually have paid for that. It is, and you have a certified license that says this is bona fide use. Okay, so that's if you're going to use pre-made beats. Okay, if you're licensing your own beats via third-party websites, then make sure you retain your rights. Okay, review the terms and conditions on whichever website or platform it is that you're contemplating uploading to, and make sure that you have those rights held. Okay, make sure that you receive a credit for your work, and ensure that a songwriting share is factored into those T's and C's. Once again, you want that songwriting share so that you can go and register that, so that once again the income can start flowing through. And that is my very dense yet hopefully informative take on the questions of tonight. I'm going to throw back over to Caroline and Nikki now. But also, I'll just remind you that, if there are any other questions, comments, or other topics of conversation, if we can't cover them now, I'm happy to take them on notice.
Amazing. Kurt, I have been sitting here. I have questions. Can I just say, though, one of the most beautiful things for me listening to that here was just how much of what you said aligned beautifully with the sort of things that we would say from the writer's perspective, like purely the APRA AMCOS perspective. So thank you so much. Like, comments have been coming through all night about how clearly you've given this information. This has been awesome. But anyway, we have questions. You're right. I should stop blabbing. So let's take it from the top. Nice, easy one to start with. Can you become an MPEG member if you do not live in Victoria? Suzanne is based in WA, and she would like to know.
Suzanne, absolutely you can. MPEG is for Australia. The only reason I mentioned Victoria before is because the Victorian Music Development Office have funded a program that is specifically for Victorians. We are nationwide. We have members in every single state and territory in this country, and you can definitely sign up. The only criteria is that you will have to have a certain amount of credits to your name. Okay, so if you head to our website, and that could have gone up in the chat, then you will be able to see exactly what our criteria is for becoming a member.
Perfect. Yes, we did put mpeg.org.au in the chat. We also put artslaw.com.au based on your advice about getting legal to look over contracts, because
absolutely
that is also advice we would give.
Yep.
So yes. All right, next question comes from Mayuresh. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Hi, Kurt. I'm releasing an adaptation of a Radiohead song, and people are curious about what song that is. So if you could pop that in the chat, that'd be great. I'm releasing an adaptation of a Radiohead song with permission from their publisher, signed contract, with conditions. 100% copyright is retained, I should say, by the original songwriters, and they have to credit the original title and writers. The question is, what royalties would they be eligible for, if at all? And if for a sync scenario, he understands the songwriting royalties and mechanical royalties, but yes, in this case, the adaptation, what might they be entitled to as an adapter?
Okay, so can I just clarify, are you, is the question mainly pertaining to sync?
No, I think it is if the copyright in the words and music is still going to be retained 100% by the original writers.
Yes.
What royalties would the adapting artist be entitled to? Would sync be one of them?
Could sync be one of them? Potentially, yes. And look, as a law student, I'm going to be really annoying and give the classic "it depends" answer. Sync could potentially, because once again, if it's the sync of the master recording, then you should have rights in that master recording. Okay, hence ostensibly you would have a right to a royalty out of that, but that is not going to negate any other royalty, particularly obviously songwriting or the and perhaps you can help me here, Nikki. I understand if you do a cover, there is a certain standard set percentage on the mechanical that the songwriter would also get. Is that correct, or am I confused on that?
So from our perspective, if you were to do a cover, or in this case, an arrangement from us, APRA AMCOS, 100% of the songwriting credit is still being retained by
Absolutely.
the original writers. So you
Absolutely.
wouldn't get any royalties from us. But
No.
that new recording, there could be public performance royalties and mechanical royalties for
Yeah.
that sound recording. So,
Yeah.
for example, if a record label printed up copies, you could get royalties as a copyright owner in the sound recording that's being reproduced.
Indeed. Indeed.
If you release it online, then you could be getting, again, royalties for the use of that sound recording. So they wouldn't be coming from APRA and AMCOS, but they might come from a record label. They might even come from the PPCA, if you're a member.
Absolutely. And look, I can speak a little further to that in as much as one of my first projects, which I was one of the executive producers on, was an album called To Hell and Bacharach. Now, that's a really cheesy title, and it was called that because it was a all-Australian homage to Hal David and Burt Bacharach. Okay, so we took all of their well, not all of they have an extensive catalogue, but we took a bunch of their songs and we recorded a compilation album. Now, we were entitled to royalties on that recorded master. Okay, so you will, ostensibly you should, get some royalties from your version, but purely through the sound recording.
Agreed, 100%. Okay, next one. Again, this is an amazing resource. Thank you for offering. They're asking for clarity in the example of your production budget. Are the direct costs, studio booking, etc., recouped through sales and exploitation or an upfront fee, which was actually exactly the question I had. So this person has artists in their studio. This person's Brian, by the way, and Brian charges a fee per day that is separate from royalties. They also include a studio engineering fee and a mixing fee, sometimes mastering, that is separate from any potential publishing or points.
Publishing?
So any potential songwriting credit, essentially.
Does that sit separate? Sorry,
yes.
I'm just...
Are the direct costs that you had in your budget, are those recouped through sales and exploitation?
Yes.
Or an upfront fee? So are you kind of waiting to make that money back, or can you charge it straight up? Like,
look, any upfront fee, unless you've foregone royalties, okay? So I feel I should make the distinction. If was it Brian? If you're a producer and you've agreed that you're not going to get cut in on royalties, you're just going to take the upfront fee, then that's your deal. If you're getting, and you've factored in a royalty into your production deal, all of those things that I listed in the budget, including your fee, including your studio fees, they are recoupable expenses that will be paid off through the exploitation of the recorded masters. Okay, so that needs to all be recouped back. And if you have your producer royalty intact, then once that recoupment has occurred, then you are entitled to the royalty. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive unless you have organized to just take an upfront fee.
Right. Okay. So you wouldn't be charging, I think in your example, it was 25,000 or similar. You wouldn't charge that fee and then start to recoup. You would actually be recouping that 25,000 once the...
I would charge that fee. I would have that fee paid.
Right. Okay.
Yes, okay. Sorry. Yes, that is an upfront fee. Sorry, and forgive my uncertainty around that. That is an upfront fee, but that is also a recoupable fee. Okay, so once again, the two aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay, I'm with you.
You're going to pay the producer a fee, and I'm a firm advocate of that, obviously. You know, I operate on commission. So you're going to pay that fee and you're going to pay all of those costs. However, all of those costs then need to be recouped before a producer will see a royalty.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, that might have been the way I phrased it. Apologies.
No. That's good. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that?
Absolutely. Yes,
great.
It does.
Okay.
Someone has asked for some examples of the third-party licensing websites that you mentioned.
Okay. Look, the only one I really know is splice. And so I apologize for this not being my forte and this not, being a slight dilettante on this one. So, but once again, I'll refer to my very learned and talented housemate Pete, who is a composer and a very gifted one at that, who has used splice. So what you can do is, and I actually have it up here in front of me right now because we were discussing this afternoon. If you go to a third party or one of those royalty-free websites and you pay your subscription or whatever method they use, and you download a whole bunch of samples that you then put into your own production, okay? And by the way, I have no problem with any of this at all. I hate purists who go, you can't do that. Well, I don't hate them, but I sort of go, you can do whatever you want, as long as you are doing it legitimately. So with Splice, you've paid your fees, etc., and you can then generate what they call a certificate of content license. And I'm just going to read this out really quickly. And it just says, to whom it may concern, Distributed Creation Incorporated, Splice, holds the legal rights necessary to license the content further described herein and has licensed such content to Kurt on a perpetual royalty-free, non-exclusive basis. The use of the following content in accordance with the terms of use shall therefore not constitute a valid basis for a copyright infringement or demonetization claimed by a third party, including claims for master or publishing rights of the same. And then it will go on to list the particular piece of music that you have sampled. I hope that helps. And like I say, this is not a forte of mine, but I am somewhat across Splice. I hope that helps.
Yes, I think so. And the only other one that I know for a fact that our members use is BeatStars. So
okay, cool.
Can credits from your own music? Can credits from your own music, I guess, qualify you to become an MPEG member?
Yes.
Okay.
You can be self-produced as long as these are bona fide productions that are released into the world. Yes, you can be a self-produced artist.
Someone is asking for your contact information, so if you've got an address that we can provide, I'll pop that in the chat.
By all means.
Fantastic.
Yep, that's just kurt@mpeg.org.au.
There we go. There we go, click that one, done. So I'm a solo electronic music producer, producing, mixing, and mastering all my songs in my studio. What producer category does this fall under? Should I join MPEG?
I'll start with the latter first. Yes, you should join MPEG. And you would essentially fall under self-produced artist.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, you're still a producer. Yeah.
Still a producer. And you could probably be an APRA AMCOS member as well. Just saying, that's what that sounds like.
Sure thing.
Yes. How would the producer or artist split the work if the producer is also the label? So this person, Louise, records, mixes, and releases. How does a label cut work on an album, for example? And and for how long? Is it determined simply by what's negotiated by the artist and label?
Look, I might actually take that one on notice because I believe that there are numerous ways that can be approached. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. What I would counsel is just be mindful if all of those eggs are sort of in one basket. Just be really specific about what the label is entitled to and how that is actually going to unfold. And I say that because I've seen historically some labels come in and they're doing the whole deal, and before you know it, the creator walks away with virtually nothing. So, I definitely have a chat to a lawyer because these are, there are so many ways that these deals can be structured. So I'm really loath to go, this is what you should do. I say, talk to a lawyer, maybe drop me an email because it's a really fascinating question and I'm more than happy to have a look at it.
Okay, love it. Well, look, we are just over time. I'm just super good. There's so many like thank yous, wonderful session, very informative. Um, there's just a couple of questions I might try and really quickly knock off.
Yeah,
Someone
sure.
has asked, when you change the chords of a cover, is it only mechanical royalties? I'm sorry, that's not the case. You can change the key, you can change the tempo, you can change the instrumentation of somebody's song. It is still a cover. And at least from the APRA AMCOS perspective, we will still pay the original songwriter. Of course, again, if you own your own recordings, you would receive royalties from the use of this sound recording. But
Yeah.
Mechanical royalties apply both to the songwriting and separately to the sound recording. So
Perfect.
I hope that helped. Someone has asked about they're in a band, all their band members come up with their own parts, but this person is planning to offer them a percentage of the royalties. Does it sound like the way to go? Is it the way it's normally handled? He wants them to, or this person wants them to feel truly involved and invested in the project, even though they are the songwriter. Look.
Okay, so yeah, that's a curious one, isn't it? So this is, once again, you can bring this back to sort of oh gee. When you say they come up with their own parts, I mean, is that not a contribution to the song? I guess that's where you really need to drill down. Or is it that you know, they're doing the arrangements? You've got all the chords in place, you've got all the, you know, composition in place, and so then they're just, you know, um, uh, giving their creative take on that. I think that's an internal thing. Once again, I don't think there's a right and a wrong. I think it's how magnanimous do you want to be, or how restrictive do you want to be? And these are really interpersonal relationship things. So there is no right or wrong. I did advocate before that, you know, fair compensation for fair work. You know, I'm personally a fan of, you know, if you wrote 50% of it, take 50% of it. But then again, history is absolutely peppered with these sorts of arrangements in bands, you know, absolutely
Absolutely.
peppered with it. So
I mean,
that becomes, yeah, sorry.
no, I was going to say, I always think of the Beatles. Like, I'm sure George wrote
Abs
his own guitar parts, but let's face it, most of those songs were Lennon McCartney.
Lennon McCartney, absolutely. And I think Queen might have been the same,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah. So that's up to
Remember,
you.
yeah, whoever you put on that registration owns the copyright for their lifetime and another 70 years.
Yeah,
It's yeah, it's important.
it is.
Well, Kurt, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. We are just slightly over time. You're getting so many thank yous. Thank you. Helpful info. This has been great. And it really has. So thank you to
Oh,
everybody.
thank you.
No, it's been wonderful. If you don't mind, maybe we could share your slides. But
Sure.
the recording will be made available. So keep an eye on your inboxes for that. We'll get it out as soon as we can. Kurt, again, thank you. This has been amazing. On
Well,
behalf of Caroline and myself, thanks to everyone who's joined us online, and please enjoy the
yeah,
rest.
and thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye.